The moon hung high, casting an eerie silver glow over the dense forest as Mark, Sarah, and Jake pitched their tents near a secluded lake. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway, just friends, campfires, and the wild outdoors. But as the first night settled in, an unsettling stillness took hold. The usual forest symphony of chirping crickets and rustling leaves was absent, leaving only an oppressive silence. Jake was the first to comment. "Weird how quiet it is. You'd think a forest would be alive." Mark, always the skeptic, shrugged. "Maybe the animals know we're here and are keeping their distance." Sarah wasn't so sure. She had grown up camping and knew that nature rarely went completely silent unless something was wrong. But she brushed it off and joined the others by the fire, laughing and roasting marshmallows. As the flames danced in the fire pit, Sarah noticed something, or someone, lurking in the shadows just beyond the tree line. A figure impossibly tall and gaunt stood motionless, watching them. She gasped and pointed, but when the others turned to look, the figure was gone. "You're seeing things," Mark said dismissively, though his voice carried an edge of unease. Jake tried to lighten the mood with a joke, but even he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. That night, the forest came alive, but not in the way they expected. Strange noises echoed through the trees, low, guttural growls and snapping branches. Sarah lay wide-eyed in her tent, clutching a flashlight, while Mark and Jake tried to convince themselves it was just a bear. By morning, they found something chilling. Deep, claw-like scratches marred the trunks of nearby trees, and their food supplies had been shredded and scattered across the campsite. There were no bear tracks, just long, narrow prints that looked almost human but weren't quite right. Despite Sarah's protests, Mark insisted they stay. "It's just some animal. We'll keep the fire going tonight. It'll scare off whatever it is." As dusk fell again, the group huddled close to the flames, but the fire's light only seemed to draw whatever was out there closer. The growls returned, louder and more guttural, accompanied by the sound of heavy breathing. Suddenly, a rock was thrown into their camp, landing inches from the fire. They all jumped to their feet. "Who's out there?" Mark shouted into the darkness. No answer came, only the sound of footsteps circling them, faster and faster. In a panic, they grabbed their flashlights and shone them into the woods. The beams illuminated fleeting glimpses of something darting between the trees, its movements unnaturally quick and jerky. Then, for a split second, Sarah saw its face. Pale and elongated, with hollow black eyes and a mouth that stretched too wide in a grotesque grin. "Run!" she screamed. The trio bolted through the forest, their flashlights bouncing wildly as they stumbled over roots and rocks. The thing pursued them, its guttural growls morphing into bone-chilling laughter that echoed in every direction. No matter how far they ran, the sounds stayed close, as if it were toying with them. They finally reached the lake, where Mark tripped and fell. As Jake and Sarah turned to help him up, the creature emerged from the shadows, standing just a few feet away. It was tall, nearly 7 feet, with unnaturally long limbs and skin that seemed to shimmer in the moonlight. Its head tilted to the side as if studying them, and then it spoke, not in words but in a garbled mimicry of their voices. "Run!" it repeated in Sarah's trembling tone, followed by Mark's voice. "Who's out there?" Jake grabbed a heavy branch and swung it at the creature, but it moved with impossible speed, vanishing into the trees. They didn't wait to see if it would return. Together, they dragged Mark to his feet and ran until they reached their car, parked miles away at the edge of the forest. When they finally made it back to civilization, they told their story to the local authorities, who dismissed it as a case of overactive imaginations. But Sarah couldn't forget that face, or the way it mimicked them. Years later, when Sarah was scrolling through an online forum about strange encounters, she came across a post that stopped her cold. Someone had described the exact same figure, a gaunt, pale creature with a twisted grin, lurking near a campsite in the very same forest. The final comment on the post sent a shiver down her spine. Once you've seen it, it never stops watching.
Story number 2.
The air was thick and humid as Emma, Ryan, and Chris hiked deep into the forest, seeking the perfect spot to camp. They had heard whispers of this area, an untouched part of the wilderness where few ventured. The locals called it Deadwood Hollow and warned visitors to stay away, but the trio dismissed the stories as mere superstition. By late afternoon, they found a clearing surrounded by towering trees. The ground was unusually soft, almost like walking on sponges, and the faint smell of decay lingered in the air. Ryan joked about Deadwood Hollow being haunted, but Chris, always the skeptic, rolled his eyes. Emma, though uneasy, kept her thoughts to herself. As night fell, an uneasy quiet settled over the camp. The wind that had rustled the leaves earlier died down, and even the forest creatures seemed to retreat into silence. They lit a fire and tried to distract themselves with ghost stories, but every shadow cast by the flames seemed to move unnaturally, as if something just beyond the firelight was circling them. Around midnight, Emma excused herself to use the bathroom. She wandered a few yards into the woods with her flashlight. The beam flickered briefly, and when it steadied, she saw something in the distance. A humanoid figure standing perfectly still. Its head was tilted unnaturally to one side, and its arms hung limply at its sides. "Ryan? Chris?" she called nervously. The figure didn't move. Her heart pounded as she took a step back. Then, without warning, it turned and sprinted into the darkness with an inhuman speed, its limbs bending in ways they shouldn't. Emma bolted back to camp, breathless and pale. "There's someone out there," she gasped. Ryan grabbed a flashlight and headed into the woods, ignoring her protests. Chris stayed behind with Emma, trying to calm her down, but she kept glancing nervously over her shoulder. 10 minutes passed, then 20. When Ryan finally returned, he looked shaken. "I didn't see anyone," he said, but his voice wavered. His flashlight had died, and he claimed to have gotten lost briefly, though the clearing was only a few steps from the trail. Emma wasn't convinced. "We should leave," she said, her voice trembling. Chris scoffed. "We're not hiking out in the middle of the night just because you got spooked." Reluctantly, Emma agreed to stay, but she didn't sleep. Sometime after 3 a.m., a sound woke them all. It was faint at first, like whispers carried on the wind, but it grew louder, surrounding the campsite. The voices were distorted, overlapping in a language none of them recognized. Ryan grabbed the hatchet he had brought for chopping wood. "Stay here," he whispered, though he didn't sound confident. He stepped toward the edge of the clearing, scanning the trees with his flashlight. The whispers stopped abruptly. "What the hell?" Chris muttered, standing beside Emma. Then they heard it. A single guttural scream from deep in the woods. It sounded like Ryan, but the pitch was wrong, stretched and warped like a recording played backward. Emma clutched Chris's arm. "We need to go now." Before Chris could respond, Ryan stumbled back into the clearing, his face pale and his eyes wide. "We have to leave," he said, his voice shaking. "What happened?" Emma asked. Ryan didn't answer. He just kept muttering, "It's not real. It's not real." Without packing their gear, they grabbed their essentials and started down the trail, Ryan leading the way. The woods seemed darker than before. The trees impossibly close. Every few steps, Emma felt like they were being watched, and when she glanced over her shoulder, she swore she saw flickers of movement. Suddenly, Ryan stopped. His flashlight illuminated the trail ahead, where the same humanoid figure Emma had seen earlier stood blocking their path. Its head lolled to one side, and its face was blank, featureless. Chris swore under his breath and stepped forward, holding a pocket knife. "Hey! Get out of here!" The figure didn't move. Then it let out a low, guttural laugh that seemed to echo all around them. Slowly, it raised one impossibly long arm and pointed directly at Emma. "Run," it said in a voice that mimicked Ryan's perfectly. They bolted in the opposite direction, but the forest seemed to shift around them. The trail twisted unnaturally, leading them in circles. Emma's lungs burned, and her legs felt heavy as if the ground itself were trying to pull her down. Eventually, they burst into another clearing, but their relief was short-lived. Their camp was there, untouched, as if they had never left. The whispers returned, louder this time, coming from every direction. Emma screamed as the figure stepped into the firelight, its blank face now twisted into a grotesque grin. The last thing Emma remembered was its cold, skeletal hand reaching for her before everything went black. Days later, a search party found their campsite. The tents were intact, and their supplies were untouched. But there was no sign of the campers, except for 3 sets of footprints that led deep into the woods and stopped abruptly as if they had vanished into thin air. Locals say you can still hear their whispers on quiet nights in Deadwood Hollow.
Story number 3.
The 6 friends, Mia, Eric, Sam, Taylor, Chloe, and Ben, were experienced campers. They prided themselves on exploring the most remote and untouched places. This time, they ventured to the Whispering Pines, a forest infamous for the strange tales surrounding it. It was said that those who camped there sometimes returned different. Others didn't return at all. They laughed off the stories as they set up camp near a small, crystal-clear stream. The first day went as expected, hiking, fishing, and swapping jokes. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, the mood began to shift. The towering pines swayed gently in the wind, but the sound they made wasn't like any wind they'd heard before. It sounded almost human. "Do you hear that?" Chloe asked, pausing mid-sentence. Everyone grew quiet. The wind carried a soft, mournful whisper through the trees, almost like someone calling out from far away. "It's just the wind," Ben said, though his eyes scanned the darkening forest nervously. As the night deepened, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. They couldn't make out the words, but the tone was desperate, pleading. Sam suggested they turn in for the night, but none of them could shake the feeling that something or someone was watching them. Around 2 a.m., Mia woke with a start. The whispers had stopped. The silence was suffocating. She reached for her flashlight and unzipped her tent. The dying embers of their fire cast faint shadows across the campsite, and the other tents stood motionless. "Mia." She froze. The voice came from just beyond the tree line. "Mia, help me." It was Eric's voice, but it sounded wrong, flat and hollow like an echo. She stumbled to Eric's tent and unzipped it, only to find it empty. "Eric," she called out, her voice trembling. The others began waking up, groggy and confused. "What's going on?" Sam asked. "It's Eric. He's gone," Mia whispered. The group grabbed flashlights and fanned out, calling his name. As they ventured deeper into the woods, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. "Over here," the voice said again, this time in Taylor's tone. They turned to see a figure standing in the shadows. It was Eric, or at least it looked like him. His face was pale, and his eyes were wide and unblinking. He stood unnaturally still. "Eric!" Mia cried, running toward him, but Sam grabbed her arm. "Wait." Eric smiled, a slow, deliberate smile that stretched too wide. Then he turned and walked into the forest without a word. The group hesitated, torn between following him and returning to camp. Against their better judgment, they followed. The deeper they went, the stranger the forest became. The trees seemed to close in, their trunks twisting unnaturally. The air grew colder, and the ground beneath them felt soft, like it was breathing. "Eric, stop!" Ben shouted, but the figure didn't slow. Finally, they reached a clearing, and what they saw froze them in their tracks. Eric was standing in the center, but he wasn't alone. Around him were dozens of other figures, each pale and expressionless, their bodies unnaturally thin. Their heads all turned in unison to face the group. "Leave," one of them whispered, though its mouth didn't move. "Or stay," another said, its voice mimicking Chloe's. Suddenly, the figures began to move, their jerky, unnatural motions closing the distance between them and the friends. Panicking, the group turned and ran, their flashlights barely cutting through the darkness. The whispers followed them, louder and more chaotic. They stumbled back into their campsite, but something was wrong. Their tents were gone, replaced by strange symbols carved into the ground. The fire pit was cold, as though it hadn't been lit in days. "This isn't real," Taylor whispered, clutching her head. The group huddled together, too terrified to move as the whispers grew deafening. Shapes began to emerge from the forest, those same pale, twisted figures. Their blank faces reflected the firelight as they reached out with skeletal hands. Just as the first figure was about to touch Mia, she screamed, and everything went black. When she opened her eyes, the sun was rising. She was alone in the clearing. The tents were back, but her friends were gone. Desperate, she searched the forest for hours, but there was no sign of them. Eventually, she stumbled upon the stream and saw her reflection in the water. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and unblinking, and when she opened her mouth to scream, no sound came out, only a soft, mournful whisper.
Story number 4.
The old logging road twisted deeper into the forest, overgrown and forgotten. David, Lisa, and their younger brother Noah parked their truck at the end of the path, excited to explore a remote area few had ever ventured into. Their parents had warned them to stick to the main trails, but they wanted an adventure, something different. By late afternoon, they found a clearing by a stagnant pond. The water was murky, covered in patches of green algae. A strange smell hung in the air, damp, metallic, almost like blood. Noah wrinkled his nose. "This place gives me the creeps." Lisa rolled her eyes. It's just nature. Don't be such a baby." As they set up camp, David noticed something odd. Carvings in the bark of the surrounding trees, symbols he didn't recognize, spirals, crosses, and crude stick figures. "Probably just teenagers messing around," he said, brushing it off. When night fell, the forest felt alive in an unnatural way. The usual hum of insects and rustling leaves was absent. replaced by a low hum, almost like static. Lisa was the first to notice the movement. "Did you see that?" she whispered, pointing toward the pond. The others turned their flashlights in the direction she indicated. At first there was nothing, but then the beam caught a figure crouched near the water. It was pale, hunched, and impossibly thin. Its head turned sharply toward them, reflecting the light like a predator's eyes. David stepped forward. "Hey, who's there?" The figure moved, fast, too fast, and disappeared into the woods. "Let's pack up and leave," Noah said, his voice trembling. "We're not going anywhere in the dark," David replied, trying to sound brave. They gathered close around the campfire, their nerves fraying with every passing minute. The humming grew louder, interspersed with faint whispers, as if the forest itself was speaking. Around midnight, the whispers turned into laughter. Faint at first, but unmistakably human, menacing and cruel. Lisa clutched Noah's arm. "This isn't right, we need to go." Suddenly, the laughter stopped. The fire flickered violently, casting long, unnatural shadows across the clearing. Then came the footsteps. Slow, deliberate, circling just outside the firelight. "Show yourself," David shouted, holding a hunting knife. A voice answered, low and guttural, but eerily familiar. "Why leave? You just got here." David's heart stopped. It was his own voice. The others stared at him in terror. "David, what's going on?" Lisa whispered. Before he could answer, another figure stepped into the light. It was identical to Lisa, down to the clothes she was wearing. The mimic smiled, its head tilting unnaturally. "Stay with us," it said, though its mouth didn't move. Noah screamed as more figures emerged from the woods, each one a perfect copy of them, their faces twisted into grotesque grins. The firelight flickered wildly as the mimics closed in. "Run!" David yelled, grabbing Lisa and Noah. They bolted into the woods, the laughter and whispers chasing them. The forest seemed endless, the trees closing in tighter with every step. Their flashlights flickered and died, leaving them in total darkness. Somehow they stumbled back onto the logging road. Their truck was still there, but its windows were fogged, and strange handprints smeared the glass. They piled in, David fumbling with the keys. As the engine roared to life, Noah screamed, pointing at the rearview mirror. Behind them, the mimics stood in the middle of the road, their grins glowing in the moonlight. One of them raised a hand and waved as the truck sped away. The siblings didn't stop driving until they were miles away, finally pulling over at a gas station. But when they got out of the truck, the attendant froze, staring at them with wide, terrified eyes. You just came through here," he stammered, backing away. David frowned. "What are you talking about? We've never been here before." The man shook his head. "No, it was you. Same clothes, same faces. You were just here, but it wasn't you." The siblings never spoke of that night again, but sometimes, late at night, David hears faint laughter outside his window, and the handprints on the truck never wash away.
Story number 5.
5 friends, Jenna, Mike, Claire, Adam, and Sophia, set off on a camping trip to celebrate the end of college. They chose Raven's Ridge, a remote forest known for its breathtaking views and complete isolation. The perfect place to disconnect, they thought. The trail was rugged, and by the time they reached their campsite, the sun was already dipping below the horizon. The forest was eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears. Still, they set up their tents, built a fire, and joked about the creepy stories they'd read about the area. "Did you guys hear about the Witch of Raven's Ridge?" Claire asked, grinning. Mike rolled his eyes. "Here we go." Claire continued, her voice low and dramatic. "They say she was burned alive here centuries ago, accused of cursing the villagers. And now she haunts these woods, luring campers to their deaths. They find their bodies scattered, but their eyes are always missing." "Great bedtime story," Jenna said, shivering despite the warmth of the fire. That night, Jenna woke up to a sound outside her tent, a soft rustling, like someone walking barefoot through the leaves. She unzipped the tent and peeked out. The fire had died down to glowing embers, and the campsite was bathed in silvery moonlight. Something moved at the edge of the clearing. It was a woman, her back turned, wearing a tattered white dress that swayed in the breeze. Jenna's breath caught in her throat. "Hello?" she called out softly. The woman stopped. Slowly she began to turn, but Jenna couldn't see her face, just a mass of long dark hair. Then the figure vanished, melting into the shadows. The next morning, Jenna told the others what she'd seen. "It was probably a dream," Mike said, though he looked uneasy. "No," Jenna insisted. "I know what I saw." As they packed up their gear for a hike, Claire found something strange. A single footprint near the tents, barefoot and impossibly large. "That's not normal," Claire muttered. The group decided to shake it off and continue with their plans. They hiked to a nearby ridge and spent the day taking photos and enjoying the view. But as they started back toward camp, they realized the trail looked unfamiliar. "We didn't come this way," Adam said, glancing nervously at the trees, which seemed darker, denser than before. "We must have gotten turned around," Sophia said. But no matter which direction they went, the forest seemed to close in tighter. The sun began to set, casting long shadows that twisted and writhed like living things. When they finally stumbled back into the clearing, something was wrong. Their tents had been slashed open, their belongings scattered. Symbols were carved into the dirt around the fire pit, crude spirals and stick figures, just like the ones Claire had described the night before. "Okay, this is officially messed up," Mike said, pulling out his phone. "No signal," Sophia whispered, holding up her own phone. As they debated what to do, the wind picked up, carrying a faint, bone-chilling sound, humming. It was soft at first, but grew louder, coming from all directions. "What the hell is that?" Adam whispered, his voice trembling. The fire suddenly roared to life, flames shooting high into the air. Standing on the opposite side of the blaze was the woman Jenna had seen the night before. Her hair was wild, her face pale and gaunt, and her eyes were black voids. She raised a skeletal hand and pointed directly at them. "Leave," she hissed, her voice echoing unnaturally. Without a word, the group grabbed their backpacks and ran into the forest. The trees seemed to shift and twist, the paths leading nowhere. The humming turned into laughter, cruel and mocking, and shadows flitted between the trees, always just out of sight. One by one, the group began to hear voices, familiar voices. "Jenna, over here," a voice called, sounding like Claire. "Mike, help me," came Sophia's voice. But the voices were wrong, distorted like they were being played through an old cassette tape. "Don't listen," Adam shouted, but Jenna had already stopped. She turned toward the sound of Claire's voice and saw her standing a few yards away. But something was off. Claire's body was stiff, her head tilted at an unnatural angle, and her eyes were black, just like the woman's. Before Jenna could scream, the figure lunged. The others never saw what happened to her. They ran blindly through the forest until they stumbled onto the old logging road they'd used to enter. When they finally reached the car, they didn't speak. No one dared look back as they sped away. Days later, search parties went into Raven's Ridge, but found no trace of Jenna or the campsite. The only thing they recovered was Jenna's phone, lying in the dirt at the edge of the forest. The last photo on it was blurry, but it clearly showed a pale face with black, empty eyes staring directly into the lens.
Story number 6.
Eli, Nora, and Marcus had heard the rumors about the Black Hollow Woods for years. Locals said the forest was cursed, its boundaries marked by strange, ancient totems carved from blackened wood. No one who ventured too deep ever returned the same, if they returned at all. But Eli wasn't one for superstitions. When Marcus suggested camping there for the thrill of it, he laughed. "It's just a forest eye. People make up stories to scare themselves." Nora hesitated, but eventually gave in, lured by the promise of adventure. They found the first totem not long after entering the woods. It was about 6 feet tall, carved with strange, jagged symbols and crude faces, their mouths open in silent screams. "Creepy," Nora muttered, snapping a photo. Marcus knocked on the wood, grinning. "It's probably just some old art project." As they hiked deeper, the forest grew darker. The trees were unnaturally tall, their branches twisting together to block out the sky. The air smelled damp and earthy, but there was something else beneath it, a faint, sickly sweet odor like decaying flowers. By the time they reached a clearing, the sun had dipped low, casting long shadows. They set up their tents and lit a fire, the flames barely cutting through the oppressive gloom. The night started normally enough, jokes, stories, and roasted marshmallows. But as the hours passed, the woods grew unnervingly silent. "Where are the crickets?" Nora asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Eli shrugged, "Probably just quiet tonight." Marcus tossed a log into the fire, the crackle breaking the eerie silence. But then they heard it, a low, distant moaning. "Did you hear that?" Nora asked, her face pale. The sound came again, louder this time, like the wind whistling through a narrow tunnel. It seemed to move, circling the campsite. Eli grabbed his flashlight and pointed it toward the trees. Probably just the wind. But when the beam swept over the edge of the clearing, it caught something, a figure standing among the trees. It was tall and gaunt, its limbs too long, its head tilted unnaturally to one side. "What the hell is that?" Marcus whispered, his voice shaking. The figure stepped closer, its movements jerky and wrong, like a puppet on tangled strings. "Get in the tents!" Eli shouted. They scrambled inside, zipping the flaps shut. The moaning grew louder, now interspersed with guttural clicks and wet, choking sounds. Nora clutched Eli's arm. "We need to leave." Before he could respond, something heavy slammed into the side of the tent. They screamed as the fabric bowed inward, clawed hands dragging across it. "Run!" Marcus yelled, unzipping the tent and bolting into the woods. Eli and Nora hesitated but followed, their flashlights bobbing wildly. The forest was a maze, the trees seeming to shift and close in around them. The moaning followed, joined by faint whispers. "Stay! Stay with us!" They ran until their lungs burned, stumbling into another clearing. But this one was wrong. Dozens of totems surrounded them, each one taller and more grotesque than the last. Their carvings were more detailed, the faces twisted in expressions of agony. "Where's Marcus?" Nora asked, tears streaming down her face. Eli turned in circles, shining his flashlight. "He was right behind us." A blood-curdling scream echoed through the trees, then abruptly cut off. "We have to go." Eli grabbed Nora's hand, pulling her toward what he thought was the trail. But no matter which direction they went, they always ended up back at the clearing. The totems seemed closer now, their faces leering in the flickering light. Then they saw him, Marcus, standing at the edge of the clearing. "Marcus!" Nora cried, running toward him. "Wait!" Eli shouted, grabbing her arm. Something was wrong. Marcus's head twitched unnaturally, his limbs hanging limp. When he stepped forward, his feet didn't touch the ground. "Stay," he said, his voice layered with a chorus of others. The totems began to hum, their carved mouths vibrating in unison. The sound grew louder, overwhelming, until Eli and Nora dropped to their knees, covering their ears. The last thing Eli saw before everything went black was Marcus's twisted face, his empty eyes staring into his soul. When Eli woke up, it was morning. He was alone in the clearing, the totems gone. Nora and Marcus were nowhere to be found. He stumbled back to the road and flagged down a passing car. When he told the driver what had happened, the man paled. "You're lucky you got out," he said. "Most don't." Eli never spoke of the Black Hollow woods again, but every night, just as he's about to fall asleep, he hears it, the faint hum of the totems calling him back.